I thought a hall pass was just a joke until my wife used it. I realized I was the backup plan the whole time. I never thought I would be the kind of person who wrote something like this. But the longer I sit with what happened, the more I realize that if I don't put it somewhere outside my own head, it's going to rot there. This is my side of it. I'm not pretending I'm perfect. But I am telling the truth as clearly as I can, because clarity is the only thing that came out of this. Mess. My name is Nick, 38 male, and until last year, I thought I had a solid marriage with my wife Adeline, 36 female. We had been together for almost 9 years, married for 6. We met through mutual friends at a low-pressure gathering where nobody was trying too hard to impress anyone. She was funny in a quiet way. The kind of person who noticed details other people missed and remembered them months later. I was steady going, and I think that steadiness felt safe to her at the time. It was good for a long time. Not in an overtop way, but in the way real life usually is. Shared routines, jokes, and friends. Our lives were so intertwined with each other. The first crack didn't show up as a fight. It showed up as a sentence said lightly, almost playfully, during a conversation that should have meant nothing. We were sitting on the couch one night, scrolling on our phones and half watching a show that neither of us cared about. Adeline laughed at something on her screen and said, "Have you ever thought about how weird it is that we're only supposed to want one person forever?" I remember shrugging and saying something non-committal. I didn't think much of it. People say things like that all the time. She nodded like she agreed with herself more than with me, and then she said it. Some couples do hall passes. She said, just once. No feelings or strings attached. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt hypothetical in the way people talk about winning the lottery. Something that exists in theory, but not in your actual life. Yeah, I said. That sounds like a great way to ruin a perfectly fine relationship. She didn't argue. She just smiled faintly and went back to her phone. That should have been the moment I paid attention. Instead, I filed it away under idle conversation and forgot about it. Over the next few months, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Adeline wasn't cold or distant in an obvious way. She was still affectionate and present. But there was a restlessness under everything she did, like she was mentally somewhere else, even while sitting next to me. She started going out more with coworkers I barely knew. She changed her routine in small ways that didn't trigger alarm. Bells on their own, but together formed a pattern I couldn't ignore once I saw it. New clothes, new playlists, and more time on her phone angled away from me. When I asked how her day was, her answers got shorter. When I talked about mine, she listened politely, but without curiosity. I told myself it was a phase. Then one night, she brought the hall pass up again, but this time it wasn't framed as a joke. She waited until we were both in the kitchen, standing across from each other in the quiet that comes after dinner. She wasn't smiling. "I've been thinking about that thing I mentioned before," she said. "The hall pass." My stomach tightened in a way I didn't like. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said immediately. She nodded, like she had expected that answer. "I figured you'd say that. That should have been the end of it." Instead, she took a breath and continued carefully. "I'm not unhappy with you," she said. "I just feel like there's a part of myself I never explored, and I don't want to resent you for it 10 years from now." The way she said it made it sound reasonable, mature, even. Like she was doing us both a favor by being honest. I told her I wasn't comfortable with it. I told her that opening that door meant we couldn't control what came through it. I told her that if she wanted to be with someone else, She should just say that, instead of wrapping it in therapy speak. She listened without getting angry. She nodded and said she understood. Then she said, "What if it was just once? Just one night?" After that, we closed the door forever. I didn't agree, but I didn't shut it down as hard as I should have. I said I needed time to think, and that was enough for her. The next few weeks felt like living next to a countdown clock I couldn't see. Adeline was suddenly attentive again, affectionate in a way that felt intentional rather than organic. She cooked my favorite meals, she initiated intimacy more often. And she told me she loved me with a frequency that felt almost strategic. By the time she told me she had someone in mind, the decision had already been made. I won't do anything unless you say yes, she told me, looking me directly in the eyes. I said yes in the way people say yes, when they feel cornered by the implication that saying no would make them the bad guy. I told myself it was just one night. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself that if I trusted her, this wouldn't break us. The night she used the hall pass, she didn't give me many details. She said she was staying with a friend. She said she didn't want to hurt me by oversharing. She kissed me before she left, lingering just long enough to make it feel significant. I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and tried not to imagine what I knew was happening. I tried not to feel the quiet humiliation of being the person who stayed home. When she came back the next day, she looked lighter. Like something she'd been carrying had finally been set down. She hugged me and thanked me for trusting her. She said it was over and that it didn't change how she felt about me. For a brief, foolish moment, I believed her. But something fundamental had shifted, and my body knew it before my mind caught up. Adeline had crossed a line, and instead of returning to me, she had realized there was more on the other side. I just didn't know yet how much I was about to lose. Adeline went back to her routines with an almost aggressive cheerfulness. She talked about work and made plans for the future. She suggested we book a weekend trip, like nothing irreversible had happened. I tried to convince myself this was a good sign. Maybe she had scratched some abstract itch and had come back satisfied. But there was a hollowness under everything. Like the echo left behind after something collapses. She stopped asking me questions. Not in a dramatic way, just small omissions. She didn't ask how my meetings went or why I seemed tired. When I spoke, she nodded, but her attention slid away before I finished. At night, she slept closer to the edge of the bed. I started replaying the conversation where she had asked for the hall pass, looking for the moment where I should have understood that this wasn't about curiosity, but about comparison. The realization didn't hit all at once. It arrived in pieces, the way denial erodes slowly rather than shattering. The first piece was her phone. She had always been private, but not secretive. After the hall pass, her phone might as well have been an extension of her body. It never left her hand. Notifications were silenced and the screen tilted away from me automatically, like muscle memory. The second piece was her absence. She started staying late at work more often. Then it was drinks with coworkers. Then it was spontaneous. Plans that didn't include me. When I asked if I could come, she hesitated just long enough to make it clear that my presence would change the atmosphere. I never accused her of anything. She reassured me with words that sounded correct but lacked weight. "You're over there," she said more than once. That phrase became a kind of sedative. It dulled my instincts without resolving them. The third piece was the name. She didn't say it to me directly. She said it on the phone while she thought I was in the shower. A male name said casually, the way people say names that already exist in their lives. When I asked who it was, she didn't panic. She didn't even pause. "Just the guy from work," she said. He's funny. Something inside me clicked into place with a sickening clarity. The hall pass hadn't been a one-time experiment, it had been a trial run. I realized then that I hadn't been her partner during that period, I had been her safety net. The place she could return to, if the unknown didn't work out. That knowledge changed the way I saw everything that followed. I started paying closer attention. Not obsessively, but deliberately. I watched how her mood shifted depending on who she had been with that day. I noticed how she dressed differently. For certain outings, I noticed how her affection toward me spiked whenever she sensed distance forming. It was emotional management. I was living with someone who was slowly transferring her emotional investment elsewhere while keeping me functional enough not to disrupt her options. I confronted her eventually. Not with accusations, but with exhaustion. I told her I felt like I was being replaced in slow motion. I told her I felt like an insurance policy. She didn't deny it outright, she just reframed it. She said she was finding herself, and that relationships evolve. She said I should be proud of how maturely we were handling things. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't going to resolve on its own. There was no version of patience that would turn me back into her first choice. The most frustrating part was how reasonable everything sounded on the surface. There was no shouting or dramatic betrayal scene. Just a gradual, grinding realization that I was being in my own marriage. I began planning quietly. If Adeline was treating me like a backup plan, I needed to stop living like one. I started emotionally detaching in ways she didn't immediately notice. I stopped overextending or trying to win her back with effort. I just sat back and observed. In that observation, I saw something important. She wasn't happier, she was restless and anxious now. The thing she thought she was chasing wasn't freedom, it was validation. She was willing to destabilize our entire life to keep chasing it. I didn't know how this would end. I only knew that the ending wouldn't come from begging or compromising myself further. The hall pass had given her permission to cross a line. But what she didn't realize was that it had also given me clarity. Once I stopped trying to fix things, I started seeing them clearly. That was the strange gift of emotional withdrawal. When I stopped reacting and negotiating my own discomfort, the shape of the truth stopped shifting. It stayed still long enough for me to look directly at it. Adeline didn't notice right away. She was too busy managing her own internal chaos. My role in her life had already been quietly reassigned, so my emotional availability wasn't something she actively monitored, unless it threatened her sense of stability. I was no longer her partner in the way I had been before. I kept the household running, I handled logistics, and I absorbed uncertainty. I existed so she could experiment without consequences. And the most frustrating part was how invisible that arrangement was to her. She still told people she loved me. She still referred to me as her husband. But those words had become labels, not commitments. They described a position, not an action. I stopped asking where she was going. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the answer would be incomplete. Instead, I listened to what she volunteered and what she avoided. I listened to the rhythm of her days, the way certain names appeared more often, and the way others disappeared entirely. The man from work became a consistent background presence. Not overtly romantic, and not openly acknowledged, but threaded through her life in a way that felt intimate and intentional. He wasn't a mistake. He was a variable she was actively testing. Living with that knowledge was like walking around with a electrical current running through my body at all times. Not enough to incapacitate me, but enough to ensure I never fully relaxed. I started sleeping less, eating less, and thinking more. The hall pass wasn't the betrayal. It was the justification. The real betrayal was what came after, when she realized she could want someone else and still keep me intact in the background. She learned she could fracture our marriage incrementally instead of cleanly, and that doing it slowly would spare her from immediate consequences. I tested the edges of that reality in small ways. I declined plans she assumed I'd agree to. I stopped adjusting my schedule around hers and started prioritizing my own routines again. Each time I pulled back slightly, she leaned in just enough to keep me from fully stepping away. Affection would spike, gratitude would appear, and she would suddenly become present again. It was a pattern. Distance from me made her anxious, and proximity bored her. That realization hurt more than any argument could have. The conflict escalated quietly, the way real-life conflicts often do. There was no explosion, but there was pressure building behind drywall. I finally told her what I was observing. I told her how it felt to live with someone who was emotionally elsewhere. I told her I felt like I was being managed rather than chosen. Once again, she didn't deny my experience. She contextualized it. She said relationships weren't binary, and love didn't disappear just because attention shifted. She said she needed room to grow. What she didn't say was that her growth required my stagnation. After that, I looked at our finances and our shared obligations. I looked at the way my life was entangled with someone who no longer treated that entanglement as sacred. By the time she noticed something was truly different, it was already too late to reverse it. She thought my being calm meant acceptance, but in reality, it meant resolve. The shift became undeniable the night she came home and realized I wasn't waiting up for her. She walked into a house that felt neutral. The emotional temperature had changed, and she didn't know why. I could see it on her face as she took in the room, as if she expected resistance, and instead found absence. She asked if everything was okay, and I told her the truth. I said I was tired. Not tired in the way people mean when they want comfort. Tired in the way that signals something irreversible has begun. She started asking questions and seeking reassurance. She started paying attention to details she had previously ignored, and suddenly the behaviors she had normalized in herself became alarming when reflected back at her. I went out more. I reclaimed pieces of my life that had shrunk to accommodate her expansion. I stopped updating her on my inner world. The frustration from her was immediate and visible. She had grown accustomed to being the axis around which our emotional reality revolved. When that axis shifted, she felt unmoored. She accused me, gently at first, of pulling away. I didn't argue. I told her I was giving her the freedom she had asked for. That answer unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Because suddenly, the hall pass wasn't theoretical anymore. Suddenly, she was forced to confront the possibility that openness cut both ways. The irony was painful. She had wanted autonomy without displacement, exploration without loss, excitement without consequence. What she hadn't considered was that I might stop consenting to being the stable background against which she lived out her uncertainty. The conflict reached its peak, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a realization she couldn't talk her way out of. She asked me one night if I still wanted to be married to her. I didn't answer immediately, and that silence carried more truth than any speech could have. I told her I wanted a marriage where I felt chosen, where commitment wasn't conditional and trust wasn't treated like a renewable resource. She started crying and apologizing. She told me she never meant to hurt me, and I believed her. Intent, however, doesn't undo impact. What followed was the most difficult stretch of my life. We began the process of untangling our lives with the same quiet efficiency that had once defined our partnership. No shouting or public spectacle. Just paperwork and long stretches of reflective silence. Adeline struggled the most when she realized that the version of me she had relied on was no longer available. She had wrongfully assumed my presence was guaranteed. By the time we separated, the whole past felt like a footnote, a symbol of a larger truth rather than the cause itself. She had wanted permission to step outside the marriage without risking it. What she received instead was proof that some doors changed the structure of the entire house once they were opened. I walked away, not because I stopped loving her, but because I started respecting myself, and that decision, painful as it was, brought a peace I hadn't felt in years. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic rebound, no sudden clarity that made everything feel justified right away. There was just empty, echoing space where a shared life had been at first. That space felt like failure. I moved into a smaller apartment with furniture that didn't quite fit, and a yappy dog next door. Every object felt temporary, like I was camping inside my own life. Adeline and I communicated only when necessary. The tone was careful, restrained, and almost professional. It struck me how easily we slipped into that mode, how quickly intimacy gave way to administration. That realization stung more than anger ever could. She tried in her own way to reconnect. Emotionally, not romantically, but reflectively. She wanted to process, understand, and reframe what had happened as something mutual and unfortunate, rather than something caused. I listened without engaging. Not out of cruelty, but because I had learnt something essential during the collapse. Not every story needs my participation to exist. She talked to me about confusion, about feeling lost, and about not knowing how things had gone so wrong so quickly. I didn't correct her. I had spent too long translating my pain into palatable language for someone else's comfort. I wasn't going to do it again. The frustrating truth was that from the outside, nothing about my life looked broken. I was functioning, stable, and even polite. But internally, I was rebuilding something fundamental. The hardest part wasn't missing her. It was missing the version of myself who believed love was maintained through endurance alone. I realized how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being reliable and flexible. Those traits had served me well until they were used as justification for my erasure. It was the slow redefinition of loyalty into something optional, something adjustable based on mood and opportunity, while still expecting the benefits of unwavering commitment in return. That imbalance had almost convinced me it was normal. I started therapy because I wanted to understand how I had agreed to so much while asking for so little. The more I unpacked it, the more obvious it became. I had been afraid that drawing a firm boundary would make me disposable. What I learned instead was that allowing myself to be treated as optional had already done that. Adeline reached out less over time. Not out of malice, but because she had nothing left to negotiate. The version of me she knew how to interact with no longer existed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that things hadn't gone the way she'd hoped. The man from work hadn't turned into a future. The excitement had faded under the weight of reality. The novelty that once felt liberating now felt shallow. That information didn't bring me satisfaction, but it did bring confirmation. I wasn't replaced because I lacked something. I was sidelined because she needed something no partner could sustainably provide. Constant validation without accountability. One day, I realized I hadn't thought about her choices in weeks. The hall pass, once the center of my emotional universe, had become irrelevant. What mattered was what I had learned about myself. My presence was valuable. My trust was not infinite, and that love without mutual restraint isn't freedom, it's erosion. By the time I felt truly steady again, I was no longer interested in rewriting the past. I was focused on building a future that didn't require me to negotiate my worth. Adeline and I finalized everything without drama. We had a mutual acknowledgement that whatever we had been trying to preserve no longer existed in a form worth saving. She looked tired and almost older in a way that comes from confronting consequences too late. I wished her well without meaning anything by it, and I meant it. The satisfaction came not from her regret, but from my release. If you're reading this and wondering whether something similar could happen to you, here's the uncomfortable truth. It doesn't start with cheating. It starts with reframing loyalty as limitation. And it ends when the other person realizes that love without reciprocity is just maintenance. I don't hate Adeline. I don't resent her. I'm grateful to her, in a strange way, for forcing me to confront a version of myself I had outgrown. Holopass didn't end my marriage. It revealed that it had already been slowly ending, under the guise of honesty.